Welcome to session 2 of the 10th China Roundtable, an outlook on LDC's accessions. My name is Axel Addy, and I'm the former Minister of Trade and Industry and Chief Negotiator of Liberia's accession to the WTO. I will be your moderator for this session, which examines the impacts of WTO accession on Article 12 LDCs and discusses the main accession challenges from the lenses of Article 12 members and acceding LDCs. The 10th year anniversary of the China's LDCs and accessions program is also a landmark in the history of WTO accessions. It provides us with a timely opportunity to look into the history, achievements, and participation of the 9 Article 12 LDCs that have joined the organization, and to debate on how to move forward, both in addressing post-accession challenges and in assisting acceding governments as they continue in their accession journey. To set the scene for our conversation today, let me recall a few figures on LDC's accession. To date, out of the 36 countries that WTO members have welcomed into the organization since 1995, 9 acceded as LDCs: Nepal and Cambodia in 2004, Cabo Verde in 2008, Samoa and Vanuatu in 2012, Lao PDR in 2013, Yemen in 2014, and most recently, Liberia and Afghanistan in 2016. Of these LDCs, Cabo Verde in 2008, Samoa in 2014, and Vanuatu in 2020 have all graduated from the LDC status. There are also currently 23 governments in the queue to accede to the WTO, and 8 of them are LDCs: Bhutan, Comoros, Ethiopia, Sao Tome and Principe, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Timor-Leste are all undergoing the accession process. 6 out of them are also classified as fragile and conflict-affected countries, according to the latest World Bank listing. Today, later in our discussions, we will have the opportunity to hear many of these governments' experiences. I know from personal experience how demanding and rigorous the accession process can be, especially for LDCs. The average duration of an LDC accession process is 12 years and 9 months, which is about 2 years longer than the overall average duration for all Article 12 members. Not only does it require strong political will and leadership and a highly committed and motivated negotiating team, it also relies on the trust of many friends. In this regard, the assistance of the WTO Secretariat and development partners is crucial to the overall process. It is crucial because the accession process is one of deep institutional and economic reform that demands a lot of hard work and commitment on the part of the acceding government. However, WTO membership is not the end of the process. Rather, it is a symbolic beginning. It represents the openness of the government to the underlying principles of the multilateral trading system of non-discrimination, transparency, and signals the commitment of the government to engage in a rules-based trading system. Above all, it is an opportunity to be better equipped with tools to promote structural reforms that can strengthen a country's economic resilience and boost reconstruction, which is of special interest for those in fragile and conflict situations, both internally and across borders. With these introductory remarks, let me open the floor to our panelists who will present the main findings of the study, Accession of LDCs to the WTO, Challenges and Opportunities. They will walk us through the history of LDC's accessions, as well as providing an overview of Article 12 LDC's accession commitments, post-accession implementation strategy, and participation in the WTO with lessons learned. After the presentation of the study, I will welcome comments from Ms. Cecilia Klein, former United States Trade Representative, Senior Director for WTO Accessions. And thereafter, we'll open the floor for an in-depth discussion. Let me start now by inviting Mr. Patrick Lowe, former WTO Chief Economist, and Mr. Mozamil Shenwari, former Deputy Minister of Industry and Trade and Chief Negotiator of Afghanistan accession to the WTO, to make their presentation on the study. Our two presenters today are no strangers to the trade community. Patrick worked in the WTO Secretariat from 1995 to 2013, where he was responsible for overseeing WTO's research work and statistical services. Patrick also served as the Chief of Staff to the WTO Director General Mike Moore from 1999 to 2001. He now works as a Geneva-based consultant on trade and trade-related matters. Mozamil led Afghanistan's accession negotiations to the WTO, which were concluded in 2015. He also served in various senior government positions, including Deputy Minister of Commerce and Industry, Senior Advisor to the Chief Executive of Afghanistan on Trade and Regional Economic Cooperation. Now, before I turn the floor over to Patrick and Mozamil, let me say a warm welcome to all of you participating in this session today. I also want to use this opportunity to personally extend my thanks and appreciation to the WTO and the government of China for the China program, which was critical to Liberia's conclusion of its accession in 2015. The Liberian government benefited from over 400 capacity building and training activities for young civil servants, both in person and online. The Liberia accession success story is a testament to the hard work of the many civil servants who went back home to contribute their talents and sweat to the accession process. So thank you all for this valuable program, critical to LDC's accession. I now invite Patrick and Mozamil to present their findings. Patrick, Mozamil, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Axel, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, as appropriate to everybody. If you just give me a moment, I would like to share my slides, share my screen to put up the slides. Okay, I think that should be visible to everybody. I'm going to...
I think this is my presentation.
Oh, goodness, this is really embarrassing. That would be terrible, wouldn't it? Now I've got to go and find mine. So sorry about that. Unless you have mine right there, Sophia?
Yes, I can look for it.
Well, then let me look for it. If you're going to look for it, I'll find it. Don't worry.
Okay. I also have Mozamil's.
It's going to take me a moment. Very sorry about that. I think it must be because yours are prettier, Mozamil, that I picked yours up instead of mine. Okay, apologies for that delay. I'm going to talk briefly about the background of the establishment of the group of LDCs in the trading system, and then a little bit about the process and the commitments. And Mozamil is going to talk about what happens once you're in the WTO as an LDC, and of course that in many ways is quite a lot more challenging, I would argue, and it's a long-term challenge than the already challenging process of acceding. The UN, as everybody knows, but it's very quickly, the UN established the LDC grouping in 1971 in recognition of the particular challenges faced by the poorest economies in the world. The initial grouping was 25 countries, there are 46 today. the lists updated with exits and entries, and this is something that is done in the UN. It's not done by the WTO. And the criteria that are used, broadly speaking, are income levels, the level of human assets and of economic development and environmental vulnerability. So this was started in the UN, but the GATT, it was the GATT back then, got into the Act in the 70s in recognition of the fact that trade really is a vital component of the whole story of development. And so the first reference to the LDCs actually can be found in 1973, when the Tokyo round of multilateral trade negotiations was initiated. And then in 1979, when the Tokyo round results came out, the LDCs were recognized as a specific category with special provisions within the framework, the broader framework of special and differential treatment in the WTO, or in the GATT, then in the WTO later. I think one thing to notice about this is that, contrary to the situation in the WTO more generally in relation to development and who's a developing country and who isn't, the LDC situation is very clear, not least because it is organized and determined by the UN in New York. Trade is so fundamental, but I think in particular for the LDCs, when it comes to accession, this is a truly transformational process in terms of trade policy reform, policies, processes, institutions, all in the name of bringing greater stability, predictability, consistency, accountability, and all the accompanying benefits of comprehensive reform. Axel has already made reference to this. And also he's also made reference to the FCS countries, the fragile and conflict affected states, for whom all this is even more true. So I think the WTO and involvement with the WTO is an absolutely essential building block for development. And some of the elements of support for LDCs in the context both of accession and post-accession, there is the Subcommittee on Least Developed Countries, which monitors the work program for LDCs, including the guidelines, which I'll say a little bit more about it shortly, and focusing especially on areas like market access, technical assistance, and of course accessions. Then there's the China program, which has already been discussed yesterday, mentioned also by Axel, with its 5 pillars of activity. Then there's the WTO's own technical assistance activities, which increasingly in recent years has involved the WTO Accessions Division with their own programs of LDC support. And of course, in addition to the China roundtable support, other members also have programs to support LDCs, both in the context of accessions and post-accession. And then, of course, we have the G7 Plus Accessions Group and its involvement with the Trade and Peace Initiative, also discussed yesterday. Those numbers on the right in blue, 35 members of the WTO, Axel mentioned these numbers, 17 have applied for accession to the WTO, 9 have exceeded, 8 are in the process. The average duration of Article 12 accessions, approximately 12 years, ranging from 8 years for Liberia and 17 years for Vanuatu. I can remember 20 years ago when Vanuatu first was ready to accede, and then Vanuatu had second thoughts and didn't actually come to accede until about a decade or so later. So, you know, a lot of the stories about the length of time it takes is to do with pauses in the activity, pauses that may have been related to considerations about how to do this or preparations. But in any event, it is you're in for the long haul. Liberia is considered a particular success in having done this in 8 years on the basis of a very focused and very well supported, domestically supported accession process. Now, 2 particular documents that are complements for negotiations for accession by by LDCs, the guidelines of 2002, which essentially recognized that LDC should not be asked for more than is consistent with the domestic capacity and development situation. And of course, this depends a lot on the capacity that the LDC itself develops during the process to know what's good for it and what is not so good for it, and to be able to make the case. The procedures also seek to clarify and simplify fast-track procedures and emphasize the essential role of technical assistance. The 2012 guidelines were really a strengthening of the 2002 guidelines with a bit more specificity. And in the process of that, some benchmarks were established for consideration as what would be the norms for LDC accessions. In agriculture, binding all tariffs, that's what every country did in the Uruguay round, and for LDCs at an average rate of 50%. For non-agricultural products, binding almost everything, 95%, with an average of 35%. And in services, the document really just reiterates the development provisions contained within the GATS agreement. And it talks about appropriate phase-in periods. And in other words, don't expect a country to say on day one, now we're in the WTO, we can do everything we said we would do. It's going to take time. We're going to need phase-ins. Technical assistance is still going to be important. And of course, there's also a mention of the importance of transparency on both sides of the aisle in terms of this whole process. Steps in the accession process, this will be familiar to many, if not everybody. You've got to have a working party. Then there's the quite arduous task. I've been involved in one or two of these in days gone by, of the preparation of a memorandum on the foreign trade regime. Then the working party is established, and the working party starts to meet. And for the Article 9, the 9 Article 12 countries that have already acceded, they had between 2 and 11 meetings during that whole process, depending on which country it was. And then you have this process of written questions and written answers, which are based on the draft memorandum. And this is also a pretty tough process. And the number of questions that were asked of the 9 have ranged from 343 to 1,224. A lot of work involved in that. And then, of course, there's the bilateral negotiations with interested parties on tariff bindings and services commitments. And that's usually based on an initial offer list by the acceding country. And the offer list goes through a number of iterations before the deal is struck. But most of those negotiations are actually bilateral. And then finally, you have the accession protocol, which is the working party report, which has lots of policy commitments in it, the schedule of access commitments on goods and on agriculture, and the schedule of specific commitments in services. And that's the package that goes forward. So this is just a quick summary, taken straight out of the report, of the commitment paragraphs in the accession, in the working party reports of the 9. And you can see that there are quite a lot of paragraphs which have very specific commitments in them, and also the number of legislative instruments that are involved in the final outcome. And the average is for commitment paragraphs of 30 and the legislative instruments 91. So it is a massive operation for the country concerned to get its legislation in place. Some countries do a lot of it before they even get in. None of them, I don't think, get through all of it before they get in, but then the question is to carry on and get it done. The coverage of, I'm not going to read out this list, but it's pretty formidable when you look at it. The potential coverage of accession commitments that come out of its working party report, the whole range of trade policies that are both domestic with trade effects and policies that are directly at the border, but a pretty formidable list of commitments that have to be looked at, worked through, and implemented. Now, this, if one were to do a comparison with what I said about the 2012 commitments that were indicated in the document prepared for least developed country accessions, and compared these, I think the comparison would be pretty favorable in terms of what these countries have been able to commit in terms of their binding coverages, their final bound rates of agricultural and non-agricultural products, and the number of service sectors they've covered. So again, this comes straight out of the report and can be studied, but I think it's impressive. I think this is a very positive story overall for the LDCs and the commitment of these LDCs to make the WTO actually mean something for them in terms of their own policies. The other big challenge, of course, is to make the WTO mean something for them in terms of what they can get in return from existing members. And that is something I think that Mosamil will have something to say about. So that's all from me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Patrick. Mosamil, your mic is off. There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Axel. It's a pleasure to be part of such strong gathering that we have Patrick Law and Cecilia Klein with their experience negotiating with the one working on the Secretariat side and the other negotiating with the countries like us, those they went through the accession process. So I think it will be a good panel discussion for those countries that they are acceding right now. Second, the study already, Patrick talked about the initial phases, how things started. So I will come to the post-accession. So if I can ask Sophia, if you can share the slide. Let me start thanking China for their continuous support to LDCs. Afghanistan is also one of the countries that got support from China in the accession process. We were able to train something like 60 of our officials back at that time when we were negotiating in China. And besides that, we utilize many capacity building programs that provided. And I think that's a good platform for the LDCs that they're acceding to World Trade Organization to benefit from that. And we will see that later on in the presentation, that how capacity building is playing an important role in the overall accession process. So I will come to the post-accession process. Many countries that when they finish their accession process, they think that, okay, the job is done and now relax. No, it's a time for to restart and you re-evaluate your situation. And if you start that, I think you can achieve whatever you expected in the negotiation and also in the accession process. So the important thing that this study covered as well, that we went through all 9 LDC member, Article 12 LDC member, and we looked to their strategies and we asked them information. The information that was provided to us, 7 of the 9 LDCs that they did made the post-accession implementation strategy that helped them to achieve whatever they expected in the negotiation. So a kind of good thing or for a learning thing for the coming LDCs to the WTO, especially for the post-accession process, it is important that they should designate a lead ministry the way they did it for the negotiation. And we will come later on to the process, because that will help that ministry to take the lead role and start implement the commitment that they have made in the process while they were negotiating. Second, the establishment of interministerial structure is quite important because WTO process as the accession process is done or is carried out by many ministries together. Now the implementation will be done by the same ministries. And that's why you have many, for example, 10, 15, 16, 20 ministries. There should be a kind of interministerial structure at two levels. One, the technical level that they should meet on a regular basis, mainly monthly basis or something like that, and the other quarterly basis or once or twice a year with the high level that the minister should participate. Private sector, it's so important in the process. You have to take it with you, whether it's in the negotiation process or whether it's in the post-accession process. This is quite important, and you have to work with them to utilize, educate them, build their capacity to utilize the WTO rules and norms and the commitment that the government or the negotiation team made. It's quite important that you should have a proper representation in Geneva. We know that the problems for the LDCs that they cannot afford full mission in Geneva, but they can afford 1% designated person in UN mission in Geneva. That will help them to interact with WTO, utilize the opportunity there, and whatever discussion, they should be part of it. You know, when we look to many countries, like that was the case in Afghanistan when we started work, you know, we pre-planned that we will have our full-fledged mission in Geneva. So that will help us to interact with WTO, utilize WTO to the maximum level, and also help Afghanistan to build their economy. And that's why we asked the President Office for special permission. Maybe we might reduce 1 or 2 diplomats somewhere here and there, and we can base it there. So that is quite important. But if you, as an LDC, if you cannot manage to have a full-fledged representation there, try to have 1 or 2% in the Geneva setup. And next slide. Participation, when we talk about the participation and also the benefit of having full-fledged representation there, it gives you opportunity to be there in the WTO and also to lead the committee. If you look to the situation here, Afghanistan is the last LDC who acceded to WTO. But if you look to the table, you have 4 position that Afghanistan occupied as a head of the committees on rule of origin, trade and development, trade facilitation, and working group on trade, debt, and finance. So that is, you know, by itself a clear example that you get involved, but you not only as a participant, but you can go there and lead the process and initiate things and share your idea. And lately we have Nepal that they are on the committee on custom valuation. Next slide, please. We also look to all these 9 NDCs and the information we receive from them and also the WTO. We see that they were quite active in the joint statement initiative and also plurilateral agreement. In joint statement initiative, all countries except Nepal and Samoa, they are not part of any joint statement initiative, but other they are quite actively involved in that. And plurilateral agreement, Afghanistan is already member of ITA and observer to GPA. And Lao PDR, they are member of ITA and also ITA expansion. So that shows their participation inside there. That will help them to understand the different topics of the WTO. They can convey back to the people back in the country and how they can communicate, how they can work, and how they can utilize these opportunities that they are having it here. Next slide, please. It's not only that they are busy on the committees and discussing things, they're also quite active in the ongoing negotiation in the WTO. If we look to the overall countries, every country, the LDCs, they participated in many of these negotiations. Again, when we look to those countries that they have representation in Geneva, they are able to participate in many of those meetings. Whether we talk about vaccine, currently it's a highly debated issue, not only in WTO, but overall, especially after, where we have this Corona COVID case. And beside that, the fisheries, there are countries that they're involved in the negotiation and they're there, and many other committees. So that shows that the more you participate, the more you gain hold on the topic that WTO is discussing it, and the more you get involved in the process. Next slide, please. Trade policy reviews, that is quite interesting. All these 9 countries, they participated in 83 trade policy reviews of other countries, and that's a good number because they show their presence there, they have their participation there, they talk there. Many countries, they participated as a head of the LDC groups, and they provided statement there that is also showing a support or understanding the practice of other countries that they are doing, especially some of these LDCs, they already had their 1 or 2 or the 3 trade policy reviews. For others that they are coming through or they will be going through the trade policy review, it is quite important that they should understand what's going on in the trade policy review, how a country present their trade policy review, and how they negotiate with the members and how they present themselves. So that is a kind of learning process for them as well. Next slide, please. That is quite important table, and that is what I call it the invisible hand of the WTO in the overall accession for the least developed countries. When we were working on those things, why we put it 2 separate numbers? One is up to end of 2018, and the other is 2021. Well, because of the corona, we separated that even at that time, when there was restriction on the travel, there were difficulties in travel, we still managed to achieve many of these training programs, both online training program as well as face-to-face training program. On average, these 9 countries, they receive 817 capacity building program. That's a huge, huge investment. I was just checking the Samoa figures with their population. And that's somehow 0.5% of the total population of the Samoa that they receive the capacity building program from the WTO. So that played quite an important role. Some things we feel it, some kind of support that we feel it directly that is done. Sometimes, it plays invisible hand, and also it helped the country to develop. For example, in our negotiation team, when we were doing our accession, I force all negotiation team that they should go through the online training program, and then they will be able to go to face-to-face program. So it helped our team a lot. It helped Afghanistan a lot. The same way it helped each and every country that they utilize that. So I think capacity building program, and that somehow we are discussing this issue as well on a day that the China completed 10 years of the capacity building program that they're having it for the LDC's accession. So I think the overall work of the WTO Training Institute and the all partners that they're supporting WTO and working together and providing these capacity program, I think that is an amazing job, and I think it should continue. My advice to future coming LDCs is that interact with the Training Institute of the WTO with accession division, build your own demand that what area you need technical assistance and how many people you need for the technical assistance they should support you while working, while acceding to WTO. So it will help you not only while acceding to WTO, but at the same time, it will help you in the post-accession. So it will be easy for them to understand the concept that you negotiated in the accession negotiation. So the most important part that I found it, and I was quite surprised, is that on an average 817 persons receive the capacity building program of the WTO. If you convert it to the, in terms of money, so that will cross millions of dollars. And many people didn't notice that. So I think that is one of the key areas that I wanted to stress on that the LDC should utilize it. Next slide. Many LDCs that they initially, when they wanted to come to WTO, they said we should utilize the WTO platform and we should utilize it. Afghanistan was one that we said, okay, we will use the dispute settlement process. But up to now, we haven't seen maybe the ability was not there, or they didn't want to move ahead with the dispute process. So neither of these 9 LDCs, they have either they are complainant or responded to any dispute. They're as a third party. In Afghanistan, of course, is the third party to 3 disputes, and that is quite interesting. Again, it's also linked to the presence of Afghanistan and the way they can convey their message to the platform of the WTO. Next slide, please. Notification submitted by Article 12 members to different, WTO committees that we are having. On an average, you will have different committees like 35, 73, and all those things. Yemen is the highest, but it is part of the regional notification. So that's why the number is coming quite high. The TBT, you have 303 as a part of the regional notification, which is coming in Yemen, part of it. So that's showing. Other than that, they're quite active on that end, because for the transparency, for the active involvement with WTO, I think that's a good sign that they're moving ahead with that. Next slide, please. What are the lessons learned and the recommendation for the acceding countries? It's so simple. Like those, many of the acceding, they already started their negotiation. So it is quite important that you should have the overall accession plan, that how you want to accede, what are the things, what are the aims that you should develop. A single ministry should lead the process. That is quite important, and they should have a WT unit so that can function as the coordinating unit. Because we saw a problem in some of the countries, and especially that is in most of the LDCs, that always there is a dispute between Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Commerce who should take lead on those things. Because Ministry of Foreign Affairs, normally they think that, okay, we are the people that, we should lead outside work. But when it becoming a technical issue, so Commerce says it's our job. So whoever is handling the trade issues, investment, industries issue, I think they should lead the process, and they should have a WT unit so that unit can function, as a hub. Chief negotiator is quite important to have chief negotiator. And once we have the chief negotiator negotiating team, for LDCs, for developing world, it might be easy. The technical people, they can be introduced from each and every ministry. But for LDC, it's a completely different issue. In most of the cases I saw, especially I myself led the process. Normally, you receive a favorite instead of the technically sound person, because for any ministry, who is minister favorite, that who should be sent to Geneva. So that's why it becoming a tough call for chief negotiator, and he should identify the people who can work with, and they can perform their work in the ministry, and then they can help the overall accession process. Capacity building of negotiation team is quite important. In our case, we did the initial capacity building program. We have provided them the technical support. We give them exposure visit, and we ask them to sit and watch the working party meeting. So that helped the team a lot, and it was easy for us when we were negotiating the process. It's quite important. Normally, when you are not member and you are still negotiating, so your mission for UN in Geneva, they're the responsible entity. And most of the time, if the Commerce Ministry is leading, and then Foreign Affairs, the communication gap is always there. So it is quite important that at least one person should be assigned as a liaison officer and to UN mission in Geneva before getting a session. We did that, and it helped us a lot in the process. Actually, we assigned 2 people in our mission, a UN mission to Geneva, and they were working kind of having dual reporting, one to ambassador in the embassy, and second directly to ministry. And that will reduce this or help us to avoid that communication gap. And whatever we had, we could access it directly. The other key message is that use your accession process for domestic reform. It's quite important. Like in the accession process, you normally receive a lot of support from the donors, technical assistance is there. So whatever reform you want, just include it in your package while working on the accession, and tell the donor that, okay, I need this thing to be done as a part of our accession process. That will help you a lot. This is quite something that you as a chief negotiator or negotiation team or lead ministry or a government should work on those domestic reform and try to get those things achieved before your accession process finish. Because once your accession process finished, then the support, technical support, is getting reduced, and you will not receive that much support that will help you to do a lot of work. And that is one of the problem with the most of the LDCs. While they are exceeding, they receive millions of dollars in terms of support. Once the accession is done, so the fund from the donors stop there. Consult with the legislature, private sector, and civil society. That is quite important, because that will help you once you finish the negotiation. So when you're going to parliament, so there will be debate, there will be TV shows, there will be private sector, try to consult with them, talk with them in the process, keep them involved, take them to Geneva, let them watch the negotiation, that how you fight for your right and for your country. And that will help you at the end of the day when you are getting approval from the parliament. Coordinate with the accession division of the WTO secretariat. That is quite important. Your key to WTO is the accession division. And you should have a direct interaction. You should have a WhatsApp number as an acceding member of the head of the accession division, secretary of your working party, and other colleagues. Communicate with them, talk with them. They can be your guide, they can be your help, they can be your support, they can be your consultant. So that's why it's quite important. Don't forget, two department or two division in WTO, it's quite important to be in touch with them. One, the training institute of WTO. Second is the accession division, because they can build your foundation, and they can help you to move ahead. Do not be shy of presenting an idea. There is also many people, they don't agree with me. Some people, they just come because to make the process easy. You have a standard commitment because other 20-30 members, they did this commitment, you have to do. It's not necessary. Present your idea, discuss it with member. If they accept it, that's it. One of a good thing that always I remember it in the accession process. The late Shidu was telling me that, okay, convince the member and get the things. That's the WTO. So in negotiation, convince the member, talk with them, and if they have no objection, so that's what you got. So that's why don't be shy. Present your thing. At the end of the day, maybe they say no, but you will not lose that opportunity. Maybe you might get something much better, if you present it instead of not presenting that. So that's why don't be shy of presenting idea. Last one in the pre-accession important thing is that public outreach. Keep your public aware of what you are doing. That is called transparency. That you need to inform them that, okay, we are working on this thing, we are moving on this way, we are helping that. So you have to go to university, you have to go to TV program, you have to give lecture to private sector, you have to give lectures to the public sector employees of different ministry. So that will help you not only in finalizing the accession process, but also help you in the implementation once your negotiation is done. Next slide, please. Post-accession, one key area that most of LDCs are facing is that once the accession is done, everybody celebrate that, and the donors celebrate that, and they leave in most of the cases. And that is becoming a biggest a tragedy for the acceding members, because with the support of that donor, they promise things that if the donor doesn't exist, so that will become quite difficult for the country to achieve. And that's why when you look to many members that they exceeded and they're facing problem in the implementation of their commitment, so that is the issue, because they don't have either financial resources or that human resources to implement those things. So that's why it's quite important that the soon you finish, have a meeting with donors, ask for their support, and show them the post-accession strategy, so that will help them. Post-accession capacity building is quite important, because the accession is something, but post-accession, because you need to implement things. You have to understand the TBT, you have to understand the SPS related measure, you have to understand everything coming there, custom valuation, everything. So that's why you have to work on your post-accession capacity building program. So that will help you to start implement the commitment that you are having. Involve the negotiation team in post-accession. That is one of the biggest challenge for the LDCs, because most of the member of the accession team either they lose their job, or they're shifted somewhere else, or they're brain drained by any international organization. So that is becoming a problem. So the good thing will be that those accession team, at least they should be there for a year, so to have the transition period for other people that they're trained for the implementation. Again, coordination meeting is quite important, both at ministerial level and technical level, because some of the decision need ministerial decision, and some of the things need to be dealt with a technical level. That is quite important. And of course, the last one is representation in Geneva. It's not necessary to have full-fledged ambassador position there, but you can have 1 or 2 representatives in the UN mission, or if you can manage to have a full-fledged mission to WTO, I think that will give you more opportunities to utilize the WTO accession process. So I will stop here. If there is any question regarding the study or my practical experience as Afghanistan former chief negotiator, so I'll be happy to answer. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mozamil, and thank you, Patrick, for that excellent presentation. I would like now to invite Cecilia Klein, the former U.S. Trade Representative, Senior Director of the WTO Accessions, to take the floor. But before Cecilia take the floor, I want to use this opportunity to extend from all of us chief negotiator who had the opportunity to work and sit on the opposite end of the table, negotiating table with Cecilia, to say a big thank you to her for her 30 years of experience. A lot of us learned from Cecilia, and I often say we went to the negotiating table in these bilateral negotiations with the capacity we had, and we left those negotiations even more educated and inspired and empowered to become champions of trade in our countries. And much of this is due to the work and diligence and commitment and passion of civil servants like Cecilia, who were on the opposite side of the table. Not only were they tough negotiators, but they were also teachers. They helped us understand better how valuable trade can be as a tool for economic transformation. So Cecilia, I want to say thank you for your commitment, for your passion, for being a tough negotiator and sending us home on many days with homework, to better look at our economy and see how we too can contribute to advocating for trade for development in our country. Thank you, and Cecilia, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you both, Patrick and Mozamil and Axel, for your introductions and really very, very important contributions to this as a teaching aid for countries in the accession process. I worked for my government on WTO and GATT accessions from 1985 to 2015. Afghanistan was, I believe, my last accession. And I can tell you that from the point of view of the US government, so much of what you've said today is critically important, both for negotiators, but also for the acceding countries. We had a coordination mechanism in the US government working through the Office of the US Trade Representative that brought together all the people that we needed to match technically the teams on the other side. Mozamil spoke of his group in Afghanistan. We had opposite numbers in the US, and we were working just as hard. I worked principally on rules, but then I also coordinated the work on market access and services. The statements made by Mozamil and Patrick are excellent outlines for the process and the negotiation of an accession. Yes, accessions are transformational for the countries, for the applicant countries that are going through them, but only if the process is a good one. That is, that it accurately identifies the issues and puts them on a schedule for the attention of the applicant country. The acceding country needs to be very committed to this process. It is not a simple one. When we negotiated particularly with LDCs, we were very much aware of capacity issues. The important aspect of the accession process. Yes, it's wonderful to be a member. It's wonderful to be able to defend your rights in committees and in bilaterals and in dispute settlement. You learn from others, either through attendance of the meetings or through work bilaterally within the organization. And the accession process gives you a framework for future work. However, it is the process that is the most important part, not the membership itself. Membership is wonderful, but the process is where the really hard work comes. The changing of the course of the ship so that your original destination is now somewhere else, hopefully in a better place. I completely ratify the elements of support identified by Patrick Lowe, but I would also like to mention the importance of the utilization of bilateral support. You can exploit the agenda that is created for the applicant country. That country can exploit this agenda, using it as a roadmap to get others to give them technical assistance. And since it is a commitment, it also helps bolster bureaucratic support within the government to get things done. I would say that the process being the most difficult part is not something that we anticipated when the WTO got started in 1995. The GATT process for least developed countries was, for the most part, fairly simple and automatic. But the WTO process made no provision for such automatic accession based on previous association with a member. And it quickly became apparent that the process was very difficult for countries that were resource challenged. The 2002 recognition of this and the 2012 guidelines went a long way to easing the concern of least developed countries coming into the system and help them make a better adjustment to the fact that their entire economic regime was going to be affected by the commitments that they undertook. I have to ratify the comments on the timeline. Sometimes this process seems endless. And I would say that the best part of that is that a country can simply stop answering the telephone for a while. If there's a political issue at home, if there are other priorities like wars, I've dealt with a couple of countries at war while they were trying to accede. You just stop answering the telephone. It adds time to your process. It raises questions about commitment. But the bottom line is that the applicant country sets the timeline. The biggest level of timeline is often between the memorandum on the foreign trade regime and the First Working Party, because answering those questions, while extraordinarily difficult, helps clarify what I said in the beginning, which is you have to identify the issues. The identification of the issues that you have to address within your legislation, within your bureaucracy, that is essential. It is remarkable the way the process has evolved since 1995. The commitments, in many cases, have become somewhat standardized. And that is actually a good thing, because the understanding of what that standardized commitment means has become clearer over time. But particularly for least developed countries, the commitments lay out a schedule, a time-defined schedule, and a progress report. I'm going to do this next year. I'm going to do this in 2 years. By the end of 7 years, I will have done this. Those commitments are not lightly undertaken, but they are essential to setting the schedule for an applicant country's actual implementation of the commitments and the rules of the WTO. And as I said in the beginning, that's the prize. The prize is knowing what it is you're going to be doing, how you're going to be doing it, and using the accession process to activate domestic, political, commercial, and university, think tank participants to assisting in moving all of this forward. I would say that the list of things to be done in the implementation, the selection of the lead ministry, the interministerial coordination mechanism, which, by the way, as was pointed out, should be at all levels. It is critically important that everybody from the ministerial level on down to the worker bees understands that the commitments undertaken, both in tariffs, services, and rules, that this is a roadmap for economic development. And it is something that your government in the process has given its pledged its honor in getting these things done. But more importantly, you've pledged it to yourself. I am going to clean up my process of applying for the right to trade. I am going to implement valuation, rules of origin, technical barriers to trade, rules and principles that will make my country a better country. The United States has been a member of the GATT and the WTO since 1947. And every day, in every way, our trade agencies work to fulfill the basic commitment we undertook both in 1947 and in 1995. That is what accession means. In terms of participation, it is critical to have a good Geneva representative. I can't put enough emphasis on that. No least developed country is going to be sending its minister to every single council meeting, to every single meeting of a committee that's important for the development or the progress of that country in the trade area. Your Geneva representative, be it one person at ministerial rank or two people, or as in the case of the United States, a full-blown ambassadorship with I can't remember precisely, but it was between something like 15 and 30 people, if you included everything from Marine Guards up to the ambassador. The problem with being a member of the WTO is that you get out of it what you put into it. And one of the key things you have to put into it is a really active Geneva representation. You need a really active interministerial process at the working level as well as at the political level, so that your representative in Geneva can be instructed on things that are important, and that representative has people to send messages back to. This is what they're going to be doing in the council. This is what they're going to be doing in the import licensing committee. Yeeks! This is what they're going to be doing in the customs valuation committee. I need instructions. That Geneva representative is your lifeline to the technical assistance with the WTO, just like the people back in Capitol are your lifeline to the bilateral technical assistance that you can draw on to make this happen. Mosmil might want to talk about a little more about that, because I think definitely in Afghanistan and to an extent in Liberia, we were active. Private sector coordination is critical. The United States has a full-blown set of private sector advisory committees that are operated out of our Commerce Ministry. The Commerce Ministry is not the one that writes the instructions for Geneva, but it is a principal ministry along with Agriculture, State, Treasury, Labor, and a number of others that participate in the interagency process that is coordinated out of our trade ministry, which is the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Things like this develop for a lot of different reasons. Which ministry heads your team, how you get it done, is really up to you. It's a matter of tradition. I've negotiated with foreign ministries. I've negotiated with commercial ministries. I've negotiated with college professors who were hired to conduct the negotiation. What matters isn't so much who you send, but that person is empowered through the ministries in Capitol, and that the communication lines are very, very strong. The presentations made today and also with emphasis, and trade policy review mechanism. I think it is a tragedy that LDCs are not required to have trade policy reviews more often. Why? Because frankly, they're very useful. You have the full attention for a certain period of time of 160 odd countries that are more than willing to tell you what they think you're doing right and doing wrong. I mean, how much free technical assistance can you get? Not that it's free, but it's piggybacking on everything that you have already invested in your WTO membership. The chief negotiator in the accession process needs to be a great salesman, needs to have the strong support of the government, needs to be a good listener, so he or she, Janari Genova is my principal she, also Ambassador Minister Mexi from Albania. You have to be a good listener and a good communicator with your people back in Capitol. Post-accession, your commitments become an absolute method of technical assistance, of a schedule for technical assistance. I don't think I've missed too much in here. Ongoing discussions in the WTO. If you don't have good Geneva representation with good communication lines back to all the relevant ministries not just the lead ministry, in capital. Well, it's all very well and good. You have somebody in Geneva, they get to go to meetings, they have lunch with people, they have an expense account. But I'll tell you, from my perspective as a coordinator for instructions for multiple committees for the United States in the WTO, we worked, our ministries and our representatives in Geneva, we worked them to a frazzle to ensure that we got the most out of our membership in this organization. The Secretariat is the absolute best anchor spot for all countries coming in. First of all, during the accession process, and then later as members. I'm not sure how many people are in the Secretariat now. It's 300 or 400, I think, or Patrick, maybe you could tell me. But every single one of them is dedicated to their cuticles of ensuring that members, particularly least developed countries, get the kind of support they need to participate fully and to extract full value, both from their accession process and from their participation. The United States is a member of many, many international organizations. I was proud beyond belief to be the coordination point in my ministry for the WTO. And not for all of it, there were a number of people in my office that took did specialty things. But my job was the council, a few of the committees, and accessions. And I will never regret my participation. It has been the honor of my life to meet people like Patrick and Mozamil and Axel and Micah and Miriam and Anna and all the wonderful people that I've worked with. Thank you.
Wow, Cecilia, as always. Well, I don't expect anything less. Thank you for that rich intervention. We would now like to move to the open discussion and provide participants the opportunity to share their insights, building on this rich conversation on LDC's accession. I know we now have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, and so I'm going to pose the first set of questions in threes for our panelists to respond, and then follow up with subsequent questions. For those of you who still haven't posed your questions, please go ahead and pose them in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to get the panelists to respond to them accordingly. Now we're working with about 23 minutes or so, so I encourage our panelists to please do your best to respond to the question in a succinct manner as you can. So we'll now move on to the Q&A. We have the first question is from Tran, who wants to know, what advices do you have for LDCs when advocating for a new agenda at the WTO? And any panelists can take these. The second question is from Julia Grubler, who is interested to know whether there are factors that clearly drive this huge heterogeneity regarding the length of the accession process and the number of questions to work through. Patrick had mentioned they range between 343 questions to 1,224 questions. And we have a question from Eugene James, who wants to know what are the main skills required for a negotiator in the seeding process. So I'll pose those three questions, and perhaps one of you can volunteer to start.
If you want me, Axel?
Sure, Mozamil, you have the floor.
So the first question, I think if you want to promote any agenda, you should have, of course, you should discuss it with the LDC group that it's a biggest group now. Right now we are having it. At the same time, you should talk to strong countries like go to US, talk with them, because most of the things when it's coming to WTO, of course, you have US, EU, they're the people that they go through it, they work on it, they come in. If they just stop it at the beginning, it stops. So try to do this thing, do your lobby internally, and then you can move ahead with that. Questions, what it's possible for LDCs. I think we proposed that last year also in China Roundtable. If there should be in a future, whether it's near future or maybe a bit far, there should be a work for LDCs, because you have this LDC guidelines. If LDCs they manage to comply with the multilateral side, so they shouldn't be given that tougher time in the bilateral negotiation, mainly in the market access, especially if they're following the LDC guideline. So that will make their life quite easy. Again, for the countries that they're going to, they have to be straightforward, they have to be transparent, they have to put whatever they're here in a right thing, not to mention something vague in their working, in their MFDR, because anything you put there, it will generate question. So that's why you have to be clear and when you are putting things. And the third question about the negotiation, I think the first thing you should understand the topic, what you are negotiating, what you are discussing, what you are defending. So you have to have full command on what you are defending, and then you should gain the knowledge, the necessary knowledge for the WTO, that when you are sitting with the technician or the technical people that you are negotiating with there. And as Cecilia rightly mentioned, that you have to be a strong salesman, a strong marketing person, that, you should market your situation in a way to convince the member. As I mentioned in my presentation, that, do whatever you want to do, just convince the member, and that should be your negotiating strategy. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mozamil. Patrick, would you care to respond to the second question?
I'll just talk about very briefly to the second question. I think there are a lot of factors to determining how many questions an exceeding country gets. I'll just mention two of them, which seem to me to be fairly obvious ones. One would be the quality of the initial memorandum, how extensive, how specific, how many of these questions are for clarification. The second is relatively few, in practice, relatively few members get really involved in the accession discussions. Very often it's a lot of the developed countries and then a few others with particular interests. So the degree to which these countries have an interest in the acceding country from an economic or political perspective will also be a significant factor in how far they go in questioning the acceding member. So I think those are two factors. Others may have other ideas, other suggestions.
Okay. And then the third question, in terms of the skills required for a negotiator in an acceding process. Perhaps this will go to Cecilia, given you've dealt with so many chief negotiators.
Well, first of all, I'd like to ratify Patrick's point about the importance of good documentation. And let's say, for sake of argument, that your memorandum on foreign trade isn't the most brilliant piece of work that was ever produced. That was not the case with either Afghanistan or Liberia. They produced very good initial documents, but you get questions when people either don't understand or the material in the initial documentation hasn't been clear enough, or your initial documentation has been clear and you have a major problem in a major sector, and suddenly everybody wants to know about it. That's going to happen. The negotiating strategy is to know what you need from the process, to have good coordination with your private sector stakeholders and your bureaucratic stakeholders, so that you don't go into a meeting without knowing where your red line is. I remember being told by one negotiator that if I couldn't agree to a certain level of tariff on a sensitive product, that he was afraid to go home because they would hold it against him. And in some countries, this has value. There are so many reasons why an LDC is in a really poor position to negotiate at the level that countries and entities like the United States, European Union, Norway, Argentina, Mexico, these countries are going to come at you. They're going to want a piece of you. This is their one opportunity so that their kumquats can get into your market at a decent level of tariff, so that their services providers have a chance to establish in that economy. You can't expect these people not to care. They do. Your negotiating strategy has to be good documentation, good salesmanship, good backup from capital so that you can answer every question. The questions will decline as the problems decline. If it starts out that, I remember the initial number of questions for, it wasn't a least developed country, but it was a developing country of some importance to us. The United States supplied half of those questions. And there's just no cure for it. You answer the questions stop coming. I would say that the 2012 guidelines are a very good rule, general rule for a framework. Since Mexico in '86, the rule has been full binding as much full binding as you can get. And since the Uruguay round, it's been full binding in agriculture and close to full binding of tariffs in commerce. Services, there are some core sectors that are all you have to do is pull out old working party reports and you can read what your annexes are going to look like and what your commitments are going to look like. So I would say for any LDC in the process now, get yourself a good library of previous working party reports, go through the commitments, go through the annexes, figure out what you can do, and never go into the room with bilaterally or in a group session where you don't know exactly how far you can go and what you're going to say to make sure that you don't have to go any farther. Sorry, best I can do.
Thank you, Cecilia. Now I will take maybe the last 3 questions, giving the time, and then we will try to do our best to wrap up. Please again respond in a as short, brief a manner as you can. And so we'll take questions from the audience. We have 3 questions from Tom Tambakai from Liberia, Meze Ahmed, and Talfal Al-Timimi. But the first question goes to, I think this is more directed to or anybody on the panel. This has to do with whether an LDC, what they're asking is, would an LDC lose its status, its benefits of the LDC guidelines if it graduated from the LDC status before acceding to the WTO? This is the first question. The second question is from Tom Tambakai from Liberia, and he is asking, how can LDC members improve on their notification obligations with the WTO? And the third question from Meze Ahmed has to do with the value of the LDCs, the LDC guidelines in the accession process. And maybe I'll add the last two. This one is for you, Cecilia. What is your advice to countries to accelerate the process on their accession? And the final question has to do with whether members can prevent the process from moving forward by alleging any failure of presentation of any instrument. Oh, and Comoros is inquiring in terms of how does the post-accession process work. I think Mozamil, you've gone through this. This might be posed to you. And so these are the questions we have from the floor. Perhaps Patrick, if you can start this time around. Thank you.
Well, I don't know which, I mean, I think some other people are better suited to answer some of these questions than I am, having been really in the mix. But I think I just say something about the Liberian question about notifications. When anyone makes a list these days of what needs fixing in the WTO, notifications is high on that list. So I don't think this is a problem that's specific to any particular group of countries. It's a general problem for the vast majority of countries that do not fulfill their notification commitments correctly or adequately. And I think this is a real problem for the system, because if you don't have the notifications, you really don't know what's going on unless you invest hugely into making your own research projects on what other countries are doing. So I don't think there's any magic bullet. I think it's a question of getting the right resources to actually be dedicated to doing this. But I do think it's a very important thing, which is why I wanted to mention it. The value of the guidelines, well, I think the guidelines aren't written in stone. They're not a legal document, but they are indicative. And one of the ways that at least the 2012 one is indicative of expectations. And I think that is useful. But it's also a reminder to the parties to the negotiation that the least developed countries have particular realities that they need to fix. And so even if it's not a legally binding document, it's something that can be referred to in the context of discussions about what's happening. So I'm going to leave the rest to my more knowledgeable colleagues.
Thank you, Patrick. Mozamil?
Yes. Which was the direct question regarding post-accession? Yes. I think it's quite important, the post-accession, as Cecilia mentioned in her talk, that the commitments, you should put it in front of you and you have to follow that, and you should build your overall post-accession strategy on that to move ahead with that. Afghanistan actually did quite well. The first year, even with the change of the many technical stuff that they were involved in negotiation, with the delay of 1 year, they started work and they established the interministerial committee. And the cabinet instructed the commerce minister that he should report on WTO progress on a monthly basis. And that was something that a push from the top level, from the government, it came to the bottom level, and that helped Afghanistan to do quite well in the post-accession. Unfortunately, now Taliban came, everything is completely stopped. But before that, as the study was done by Patrick Law, I think in first 5 year, Afghanistan did quite well. Even they haven't fulfilled all those commitments, but more than 50% commitment, they met more than 50% commitment, and the remaining 50%, majority of them were in the progress. So I think they were doing quite well. Regarding the LDC guidelines, that what we faced in the negotiation, actually, we delayed our negotiation, our service, our goods offer for the LDC guidelines. And we were expecting that to come out in June. So we decided, okay, we should follow that. And once we looked to that, we thought, oh, we are quite on a safe side because our level were quite low. But when it comes to bilateral negotiation, it depends on a country, what they ask you. You can use it as a blackmailing the thing that, look, this is the guidelines you guys passed and you are asking me more than the guidelines. That can help. That is one way to help you. Other way, you can unbound around up to 3% of your non-agriculture goods. That will help you a lot, because if you are a country like Afghanistan, of course, we rely on agriculture, but in non-agriculture, we got quite good thing that we didn't commit on those things. And also on services, we kept some services sector. We said, okay, we are not making any commitment. So we did utilize that, and that helped us. But of course, at the end of the day, when you are negotiating, it depends on the country, how they negotiate with you. Last question asked in the chat box by Ms. Fatima from Sudan, directly from me. The last year, it dropped down the growth because of the COVID. That is an issue. No, we didn't do any comparison with the pre-accession, because it was different from that, and that's why we didn't go to the economic performance of these countries in presentation. We put in the book just to show a kind of indicative thing, that it's not necessary that they should do much better. Yes, it's a way WTO accession helped them think, but there might be other reason as well beside WTO accession to help you to do better in the economy. So we didn't do any comparison. One, because there are different years of accession. Second, the last year it was negative because of the COVID impact.
Thank you, Muzamil. And over to you, Cecilia, for final comments.
Well, these are all excellent questions. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Least developed countries have a special status in the system. During the accession process, there are guidelines. Now, how useful these guidelines are, as Muzamil indicated, sort of depends on where you're coming from as much as where you're going. But I think a least developed country contemplating moving into the WTO should put a lot of its resources up front in preparation, in preparation for the negotiations and for where they think they need to come out. We used to have a saying in the trade policy community in the United States: you can't get blood from a stone. A country can give only what it can give. It has a political reality, it has a social reality, and the guidelines have been very, very helpful in recognizing that for least developed countries. I think a country that has recently graduated, I don't think that that's relevant. These are guidelines, not rules. And I think that a country that has specific problems should simply raise them. I mean, at the end of the day, kumquats may be very, very sensitive, or widgets. These are our two generic agricultural, non-agricultural categories. But the bottom line is you're negotiating this, and as I believe, I can't remember whether it was Patrick or Muzamil indicated, you're basically, if you can't give on one item, you may have to give on another, but that may not be hard. The value of the guidelines are obvious, and LDCs have every right to them. I would say don't let the guidelines become chains. This is your one opportunity to create space in your economy and for your development on an agreed schedule that you can wave under the nose of your technical assistance providers ad nauseum, and that will be helpful. Acceleration of the process depends on how much a country is willing to put into it. If you can't answer the phone quickly after each negotiating session, Sometimes a full working party is not a good idea. You don't really want to have to bring all these people out of their offices to Geneva. So you have an informal working party, and it gives an opportunity for a smaller negotiating team to meet. And it gives an opportunity for members with their representatives in Geneva to make a presentation, to raise particular issues. Bilateral conversation is wonderful. If you've got, from the point of view of the United States, if your people in Washington want to get involved in your accession, more power to you. But I don't think that that's a very, I don't think it's a very realistic assumption for a country that's already resource challenged to put people in Geneva, people in Washington, people in Brussels. So again, to accelerate your accession, you need a good rep in Geneva to bring home the questions, to make sure those questions get answered with alacrity, and to use the Secretariat as a source to help you accelerate. The last thing I can say, having to do with the question that was focused on, can members prevent progress? Well, yes. The reality is that this doesn't go forward without consensus. Consensus means without objection. Now, that doesn't mean that every member is going to come in with 45 pages of questions, although sometimes they do, or demands that seem unreasonable. But the reality is they wouldn't be negotiating with you if they didn't want you to complete the accession. And yes, all a member has to do is fail to form the consensus. A negative raising of the flag, and that stops the process. So if someone has taken the trouble to give you 45 pages of questions, clearly they're interested. Use that interest, work it. Make sure that when you get a chance to talk to their representatives, you get to tell them what you need and what you want, and use every opportunity for representatives from capitals to meet with your people in Geneva. That way you can focus your work. I wish you all well. The WTO is a wonderful organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thanks to the rest of our panelists. And yes, I do agree with you in terms of accelerating the process. As you know, according to the study, Liberia still is the fastest accession process, with concluding the accession process in 8 years. Of which 6 of those years were sort of a period of inactivity, and then we sort of went full force in 2014 to conclude over 800 within a period of 800 days. Now, people often ask, how was this done? And I often tell people, well, for any accession to happen, and at the rate it happened, you have to have political will at the highest level. And if you think about when we picked up in terms of momentum in Liberia, there was political will. The government, in the second term of the administration, has launched its agenda for transformation, with a rallying force, getting all stakeholders, all members of government, including all 3 branches, to rally around the AFT. And one key deliverable around the AFT is improving the private sector and trade integration. And so there was political will. And with political will, all kinds of amazing things begin to happen. And if you think about Liberia accession, we were going through this process full force while tackling and dealing with the challenges of an Ebola epidemic in the region. And imagine trying to apply for visas, for a large delegation to come to Washington, or to get to Brussels, or to get to Geneva. Political will overcome a lot of that. So long there's political will in capital, it is coordinated, and you have the support. And that then translates into the diplomatic circles in terms of moving the membership to rally around the accession. You are going to accelerate the process. I often say you also can accelerate the process by just being over-prepared. Never go to a negotiating table, especially when you're going to be somebody like Cecilia, unprepared, because it's going to show. So the confidence in how fast the process will move forward will be based on how prepared the negotiating team is. And I think the chief negotiator ability to engage the membership wherever they find themselves. So as chief negotiator, if I found myself in Washington, I engaged the Department of Commerce, I engaged the USTR, whether it was there on an official WTO related matter or not. I used the opportunity to have the back channel conversations with the technical teams for those bilateral teams negotiating with Liberia to get a sense of where we are in terms of progress, where our red lines stood, where there were areas for compromise. And then all of this feed into how fast you can accelerate the process. And you can definitely accelerate the process if you have the funding. Most accession process will not move forward without the adequate funding. And I tell people the litmus test in terms of political will comes from the government side in terms of just paying your WTO observership fees, paying it on time and paying it every year. I think that sends a message clearly to the membership that you are committed to moving the process forward. Again, political will says you've appointed a chief negotiator and you set up an accession team, and that team have developed a strategy and there's a clear roadmap. You've put up a website that is very transparent in terms of the progress you're making. I often will fly through Europe on different missions, and whenever we fly through Europe, I will stop over in Geneva for these pulse checks. These pulse checks with the bilateral on the bilateral negotiations, these pulse checks on the multilateral negotiations, and we use the WTO Secretariat, whether it's benefiting from the China program, training a lot of young Liberians. About 30 something Liberians from several ministries and agencies got the benefit of getting training in Geneva. They spent several months in Geneva, so they were exposed to the WTO negotiating process. I think all of those facilitated how fast Liberia was able to move the process forward. But political will and funding, we were able to secure about $10 billion with our working party chair, Sweden, to again bring in technical assistance, bring in technical advisors, and then pay for those delegations missions to Geneva for the working party meetings. That is critical. Imagine, with such limited budget in the government, having to pay for, on average, a delegation between 10 to 15 technicians and colleagues at the political level coming to Geneva to advocate for the process. And I say, that political will is also translated in terms of how you engage the private sector, the stakeholder, and how you get the media involved in terms of branding this as an agenda for transformation, an agenda to transform the country's economy, in spite of the challenge of dealing with an epidemic on the ground. So to answer that question, acceleration, the bedrock of acceleration comes with political will from the highest level. I'd like to now conclude by thanking all of you, our panelists, for your input for this discussion. I want to extend my thanks and appreciation to the LDC's acceding governments and Article 12 members for sharing your experiences, which confirm the important value of the China Roundtable as a platform for knowledge sharing. Let me now close this session 2 of the 10th China Roundtable with a few concluding remarks. First, as per the presentation, LDCs represent 1/5 of WTO membership. As their economies and international influence grow, LDCs need to increase their participation in global governance, especially within the WTO. LDC voice need to be heard in the WTO if we're to advocate for programs, specialized programs for LDCs, particularly those in those fragile and conflict-affected states. Second, the benefits of LDC participation is mutual. The WTO can only realize its goals, including those to promote better living standards for people around the world, to help countries develop, to give voices to the weak, to contribute to global peace and stability, if LDC's needs and interests are addressed within the organization. Third, As previously stated, the WTO accession process is a complex endeavor, but it is not impossible. It has been done by 9 LDCs, and their accessions have allowed us to gather a set of best practices that the current acceding LDCs can take on board. These include developing an accession strategy, establishing a negotiating team, building the capacity of the negotiating team, preparing realistic goods and services market access offers, establishing a good consultation mechanism with the legislature and the private sector and civil society, rallying the international community around the accession process, using the media to increase awareness of the benefits of the accession process, and finally, creating a group of friends of the accession process within the WTO membership that can rally membership support for the acceding government. Finally, after becoming a WTO member, one of the ways to reap the benefits of WTO membership is through participation in its day-to-day work. We have seen that while LDCs have been involved in various WTO activities, there is still room for improvement. The study and the experiences shared in this roundtable confirm that challenges remain, especially in a pandemic world. However, I do believe that with mutual support from international institutions, friends from the accession community, development partners, and a strong national commitment, the gains of WTO membership will ultimately be shared by all. In closing, I want to extend my warm thanks and appreciation to all of you for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to session 3, which will take place tomorrow at 12 noon on Zoom. Tomorrow's session will explore in more depth the achievements of the China program. Once again, thanks to all of you for your continued commitment to supporting LDC's accession, and I wish you all a prosperous and safe 2022. Thank you.